My name's Ken and I worked in the Gosport Ferry ticket office for 28 years. During that time I found out a lot about the history of the ferry, and I was actually allowed to look at some very valuable books in the offices. I've given these presentations several times in various meetings of elderly people. All right. This is me at the Festival of the Sea 2005 when I had my uniform on. This is the entrance to the Gosport Ferry as it was in the 1990s and the early 20s. This is the entrance to the harbour as seen from the Gosport Ferry, and as you can see, it's only just over 1,000 yards wide. And through this narrow entrance, the tides go in and out twice a day. And because of this, you have the very strong currents. And in the 1960s, an Egyptian princess was on a yacht which was in collision with the Gosport Ferry, and she was thrown overboard and her body was never recovered. This is a sort of outcrop of rock that would have been at the Ferry Gardens at that time. And in 1597, John Riddleston and Stephen Jeffreys were solicitors in Gosport, and the Portsmouth and the Gosport ferrymen used to have fights over the passengers, and during these fights, one of the men was killed, and John Riddleston wrote to the Queen, which was Queen Elizabeth I, and he asked her, and this is the actual wording of the letter, to look into the working and supervision of the transportation of the public across Portsmouth Harbour on behalf of the inhabitants of Gosport. And Queen Elizabeth I sent down, which I found out was the very first Royal Commission. She sent 3 men down by horse and carriage to Portsmouth to find out what on earth was going on. And they reported back a few days later that the same as it is today, there was more work in Portsmouth than there is in Gosport. And Queen Elizabeth I decreed that only the town of Gosport shall provide 20 good boats for passengers, horses and light goods across Portsmouth Harbour, the fare for the passenger with horse being 1 penny, or footman alone 1 penny in each direction, at least 1 boat to be on the Portsmouth side during the hours of daylight. ferrymen used to use the outcrop of rock to alight the passengers so that they could pick their way across the rock to the shore, only a short distance, and at low tide they would deposit the passengers onto the mud to get to the shore. The military built a moat right the way from the creek right the way through to where the oil tanks are now, and the mud that was thrown up became a big embankment, and Gosport was very highly populated in those days, and so the military could defend Gosport from the land. Now, 1806, a man called Robert Cruikshank arrived. Mr. Cruikshank was a very wealthy man, and he had fingers in a lot of pies, and he had shares, and he knew very important people. And he arrived in Gosport, and he stayed with his relatives at Alverstoke. And Mr. Cruikshank decided that he would go. Mr. Cruikshank decided that as the railway had arrived at Fareham, the London and South Western Railway, and he had shares in this company, he thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a railway going down to Gosport to take people to Portsmouth? At that time, the Petersfield Tunnel had not been built, and people had to go right the way along to Chichester and then along the coast to get to Portsmouth. And he persuaded the other shareholders that this would be a good idea, and so the railway came to Gosport, but he couldn't go any further than Spring Garden Lane because of the embankment, and the authorities were not going to let him go into the area of Gosport, whatever happened. So the answer was to get some sort of transport from the top of Spring Garden Lane down to the Gosport Ferry. This is a very old Victorian post box which we're in Gosport are very proud of. Stands outside of the Gosport railway station as it was. This is how the railway station got into disrepair, because the Gosport people decided that it was what Queen Victoria used, and they didn't want it demolished, so they put a preservation order on it. And this is what made the preservation order complete was the fact that Queen Victoria came out of the entrance and walked to the pillar, and she stumbled and she put her hand on the pillar, and the Gosport people thought that made it sacred. And Prince Albert decided that the best thing to do would be to take the railway into Royal Clarence Yard so that it could link up with the paddle steamer, the Victoria and Albert, to take the Queen over to Cowes on the island. And this is the remains of the station in Royal Clarence Yard, and these are the waiting rooms windows of the station, and that's all that is left. Right. There were six business people in Gosport. They had enough money. They decided that they had enough money to buy a horse bus, and they didn't have the money to buy horses as well. And there was a man, Mr. Osborne. He was a funeral director in Gosport for many years, and he had 6 black horses, and they had to be exercised if there were no funerals to go to, and so he hired them for the horse bus, and the horse bus met the train at Spring Garden Lane and took the people down to the ferry. Yeah, Mr. Cruikshank, having got the railway down to Gosport, he then went across to Cowes, and he saw the Cowes chain ferry, and he thought, wouldn't that be a good idea to go across the harbour? This set alarm bells ringing with the wherrymen, and they could see their livelihood being rather lessened, because this would be a reliable thing across the harbour, and it would go through the night, whereas they could only go in the daytime. But because of the decree, it had to be passed by law in London, and Mr. Cruikshank knew an awful lot of MPs in his travels, and the member of the House for Gosport stood up and said, "The humble petition of 1,100 watermen, who the greatest part of wives and families to keep, and many householders, will use their prayers also for the bill of the floating bridge, that it may be thrown out of your honourable house, as it will be only feeding a few wealthy and bad men to the ruin of hundreds." But in spite of this, Mr. Cruikshank got his own way. This is one of the old Gosport ferries I found down at Bursleden, and you can see that there was plenty of room for the passengers, and the other side of the middle of the ship would be for the cars. Mr. Cruikshank now formed his own new company, and it was called the Port of Portsmouth Floating Bridge Company, and he built the first one was Victoria, and it was 100 foot long, 60 feet wide, and it took 12 minutes to get across the harbour, and so this was quite an event. This is one of the first floating bridges going across the harbour from Gosport. This is where the floating bridge would come to rest out in the Portsmouth area. It's the old Portsmouth, and it's right by the Stilham West. But of course, these days the ramp has been covered over, and so this is where it started. And Mr. Cruikshank then in 1843 he built a pier at Gosport, and he had some very small steam launches. Mr. Cruikshank built this pier, but as far as I know, there are no actual photographs or proper drawings of the pier, and so we can't show it to you. This is an old advert that I found on my travels, and you can see that it says carts, goods and persons and chattels, and it's 1840. But Mr. Cruikshank, having got these small steam launches, he wouldn't let the wherrymen use his pier, and so they fortified and made safer the outcrop of rock. And Mr. Cruikshank allowed a very small paddle steamer. As you can see, it was sort of thing without any superstructure on it, and it was just basic. And he allowed this steamer, which was called the Albion, to run from his pier, and so that was the very first paddle steamer from Portsmouth Harbour, and it came from the Gosport side. And he also put adverts all round the harbour, stating that ladies and gentlemen with children can be carried at all times of the tide, as the platform is always level with the deck of the steamers, and his steamers had cream funnels. And so from that advert we know that it was a floating pontoon on the pier. And so with all this opposition, the watermen formed groups, and they made groups of 6 or 7 people. They bought 6 steam launches, and of the same kind as Mr. Cruikshank had, and they would carry 6 people, and their funnels were peacock blue funnels, which to a lot of people looks as if it's green, but that's what it's called, peacock blue. And but of course they could still only use the outcrop of rock. And in 1869, the Navy launched its first iron-hulled ship, HMS Devastation. It was launched at Portsmouth Dockyard. 1871, the floating bridge Florence was launched. And this had gas lamps and was more reliable than the previous one. And this was followed the next year by another one called the Alexander. This is the Royal Yacht Osborne, and this is the one that went from Royal Clarence Yard to the landing at Caves on the Isle of Wight. Took the royal family over. This is the royal launch, which Queen Victoria used with her maids, and in this area the Queen would sit with her maids in waiting. I found this in Portsmouth Dockyard, and it looked as if it had been discarded. It's covered with dust, as you can see. Front of the royal launch, which took the royal family from the Osborne to Caves, as the Osborne was at anchor off of Caves. And now the watermen on Sundays, nobody used to go to work in those days on Sundays except the water people and gas and electricity, and so the watermen were standing around doing nothing, and they decided that one way to get some money was to take people round the ships that were lying in the harbour, one of which was the Victory, and this is the view from the Victory they would have got from the Victory. And in 1876, the harbour station was built, and the tunnel through to Petersfield was also inaugurated, and so it was a much quicker way to get to London. 1882, trams were started from the Gosport railway station to the ferry. This is another view they would have had of the Victory. This is an unusual view, you might think, but it was where behind the wall there was what we would now call a prefabricated scaffold. It could be erected with 6 men in a few hours, and it was put up outside the main gates of the dockyard to hang people. And if somebody had to be hung, the idea was that this vast area would hold as many people as possible to act as a deterrent for acts of murder and that sort of thing. And the body would be taken. To where the warrior is now, put on into a rowing boat, and then taken to what is now Dolphin, and remains would be hung on chains on the Dolphin Wall. Now this was another opportunity for the wherrymen. They could take people out to see the grisly remains. Then the wherrymen were rather adventurous with these little launches, and on a fine summer's day they would venture across to the Isle of Wight to see view, which at one time was more popular than Ryde, as you can see from the people on the beach. And the launches would anchor, tie up at the chain pier, and they would tie up at the chain pier and wait till 3 or 4 hours and then go back. And when I was a boy and I lived on the island, we were allowed to walk on a Sunday afternoon as far as the chain pier, buy an ice cream and go back home again. The chain pier carried on until after the war, when there were some people, it had got into disrepair, and they had formed a preservation society, and true to form, the letter saying that the preservation society could keep the pier, it was destroyed the day beforehand by the council. And so began the trips over to the Isle of Wight, which eventually involved cows and going up the Southampton water. That's better. Yeah, and so this state of affairs continued until 1883, when a meeting of businessmen was called in the White Lion at North Cross Street. This is why it's called the White Lion Walk, because the hotel was destroyed during the war, and so they've kept the name. And these business people, they got enough money to. There was a firm in London on the Thames that was operating launches from Tower Bridge to Westminster, and they got enough money to ask these people to build one of their launches for them. And the trouble was that the Thames people, they decided that it wasn't enough money, and the only way that it could be resolved was for them to have shares in the company. And so eventually they launched this is a letter sent to all the interested parties. The Queen was this type of launch, which I found at the bottom of the harbour there, and as you can see, the captain would have been on the bridge in all weathers, and there would have been lifeboats all the way round the ship, and the Queen would carry 150 passengers. This was a great improvement, and so things from that moment sort of escalated, and there was a pontoon built at Gosport and incorporated a bow, because in those days watches were rather expensive, and so they had a bow to tell the skippers when to leave. And so this is the sort of launches that after the Queen, and as you can see, they're very popular with all the lifebelts round the edges, the skippers standing out in all weathers. In 1922, Gosport became a borough with a council, and one of the councillors was rather very keen on getting things organised, and so he decided that the outcrop of rocks, there were a lot of people after the war that didn't have jobs, and the council was losing money on the council houses that had been built, and so they employed every person that was able to get these embankments down to the outcrop of rock, and the household rubbish also was tipped over, and so it became the Fairy Gardens. So all the rubbish and all the embankments were transported down to the outcrop of rock and made into the ferry gardens, and they were finished in 1925. But in 1925, the floating bridge was losing money because of the motorised vans were going round the harbour, and so in a big storm, eventually in a big storm in 1957, the last one, the Alexander, sank, and the Mr. Cruikshank's launches and the ferry launches were merged into one, and they kept their original cream funnels and peacock blue funnels in spite of this. In 1966, the ferry company was living from hand to mouth with the profits, and they took out a very big bank loan and built three ferries. This is the Gosport Queen. There was another one which was the twin, the Portsmouth Queen, and there was the Gay Enterprise. These proved very popular, and they were very popular with the public. And in 1883, the Gosport pontoon was covered. In 1886, the Portsmouth pontoon was covered. And these were very big loans from the banks. And the shareholders hadn't had any dividends for years because of the extortionate loans. But in 2001, a very big event happened. 2001, we saw the opening of the Gunwharf Quays. From that moment onwards, the ferry never looked back. It was the goose that laid the golden egg. And because people came from all sorts of places down to Gosport, from the Southampton area down to Gosport, and went across the ferry and went straight to the Gunwharf Quays. The ferry started to look up, and the profits started to roll in. And in 2006, the Spirit of Gosport was built. Spirit of Gosport was built, and from then on, the ferry company has never looked back. This is the blueprint of the Spirit of Portsmouth, Spirit of Gosport. And the Spirit of Gosport was built at Bristol. This is the bridge before it was put onto the actual rest of the ship. The ferry company gave the people of Gosport this tide clock. As you can see, it's got several sections, and it tells the state of the tide. But you have to go down in the dark to see the time and the tide. Some bright boy thought of that one. And then suddenly there was a talk of a tram going under the harbour. It would go down at the railway station and come out at the Hard. But my wife said that when she was a girl, there was news of building a tunnel under the harbour, and every time it was mentioned, the cost went up, and eventually it was just something to talk about in the pub. But this new one alarmed the ferry company. They could see that if somebody got on a bus and was taken straight away across to Portsmouth, that they were going to lose passengers, and so they decided that the only thing to do was to be involved in the talks, and they were involved in the talks, and the talks didn't come to anything, because every time, as usual, when it was brought up, it was a bit dearer than it was last time, and the company hadn't invested any money, so they were quite pleased about that. And the ferry profits continued to roll in. This is the spirit of Portsmouth being towed into the harbour. It was built in Sweden, and I was on the top of the round tower waiting for it early one morning. And so this is the view we got as it went into the harbour past the Dolphin, and it was on its way to Portchester to be fitted out, because at that time it didn't have any engines or seats or anything like that. In 2007, British Rail, who owned the walkway down to the ferry, because it was attached to the harbour station, decided that they wanted 10p for every passenger that used the walkway. And the only solution to that was that the company bought the walkway. And of course this was taken from from the prophets of the Gosport, the Gunwharf Keys. And so this is the pontoon covered at Gosport today, and as it is today, the Southern Enterprise was sold to some people in Copenhagen, who opened it as a nightclub, and it caught fire in 2016. The Portsmouth Queen and the Portsmouth Queen was renamed the London Queen, and in 2017 the Gosport Queen was taken to London and renamed the London Queen. And then we come to the naming of the Harbour Spirit, and this is the managing director of Portland Islands naming it. This is a view of the boat ship as it was alongside being named. And this is the bridge as it was laying alongside the dock. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I'm sorry that that's the end of it at the moment. Thank you.